last week, we said, let's start with the objective characters. And we got partway through that. We said, what characters can we identify by functions in the story? Well, one of the characters was the protagonist. And one of the characters was the counterpoint, the antagonist. And then we also found that archetypally speaking, we have the protagonist and antagonist. We also know there's a character that represents our reason. Now, look at these words, reason and their antithesis, which is emotion. Emotion. Okay? Why are these things there? Protagonist, in our own minds, it's archetypal because it puts a bunch of our character traits together that all have kind of a collective effort in a given direction. Protagonist says, let's go out and make some kind of progress. Let's have some force to do something. And the antagonist says, let's not. You see, the protagonist represents the force to get something accomplished, and the antagonist represents the force to prevent that, or to avoid it. Prevent and avoid. Prevent is an active form of the word, avoid is a passive form of the word. So in our own minds, we're always saying, yeah, let's take action, but maybe we better not. And that's the antagonist. And that's what's fighting us. And below that, we come into play with our reason and our emotion. We say, well, what makes logistics sense? How do we go about this? Should we be doing it even logistically? But what do we feel about it, even if it doesn't make any sense? Do we just have these feelings that can't be defined? Well, that's what the emotion character is dealing with. Now, below that, we've got the typical sidekick. And the sidekick's antithesis is the skeptic. Sidekick's probably a bad word in...
Erasers.
Okay, skeptic. Okay, now, sidekick's probably a bad word because it really defines the way those characters mostly turn up. They turn up as a sidekick, but this is a faithful supporter. They don't have to be the second in command. They don't have to be the follower. They don't have to be the one that's hooked in with the protagonist. Renfield in Dracula is a sidekick to Dracula. It just means they're a faithful supporter. Whereas the skeptic is the disbelieving opposer. And that's somebody like Han Solo, as we talked about last week in Star Wars. He doesn't believe in the Force, and whatever plan they come up with, he's against it. Doesn't mean he's a bad guy. Get away from the notion of good guys and bad guys. Good guys and bad guys are heroes and villains. A hero, first of all, has to be a protagonist and a main character, and they also have to be well-liked by the audience to be a hero. If they aren't well-liked, but they're still a protagonist and they're still a main character, then they're an anti-hero. But if you have someone that's well-liked who's a skeptic, you might have a well-liked antagonist. Who's a well-liked antagonist? Look at the James Bond films. Does James Bond start things? Is he a protagonist? Of course not. James Bond responds to things. He tries to prevent the villain's plan, or he tries to avoid it. Avoid capture, avoid death. James Bond is actually an antagonist. Many action heroes are antagonists because the protagonist is defined by the function, not by whether we like them or not. The protagonist is the guy who's out there making it happen. The antagonist is saying, let's keep that from happening, or let's stop it if it started to happen. So James Bond is an antagonist, and Goldfinger, for example, is the protagonist. Goldfinger has a plan, he puts it into motion, James Bond gets wind of it, he tries to stop it. So just because they're red and blue and left and right and functionally antithetical to one another does not necessarily mean that they're good guys and bad guys. They could be any way. Han Solo is a good guy, even though he's a skeptic. The robots, who are the sidekicks in most of the story, are also good guys, even though they're antithetically opposed. Chewbacca is the emotional character, and Leia is the reason character. And they are also part of the good guys, even though they're on the opposite side of the functional fence. Alright, finally we have two other characters that we looked at to round out our 8. They were the Guardian, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the contagonist. Contagonist. Ist. Okay, contagonist, and I'll let you put the ist on there. But you get the gist without the ist. Guardian, Obi-Wan Kenobi, that's the one who is good conscience and also helping. Contagonist is the one who is the tempter, the bad side of, like the dark side of the Force with Darth Vader, and also is the one who is the hinderer, the one who screws you up. Now, traditional story theory by people like Campbell and such, although I really have to admit I haven't read that much of them, so if you ask me about other people's theories, I'm afraid that I'm kind of at a loss. I pick up a little bit, but I've never actually read the other stuff. Chris and I determined not to read it in the early days so we wouldn't pollute our own investigation. And then after that, once we had our own theory, I kind of never got around to it. But I can tell you that there's the trickster, okay, and the tempter are two other archetypes. But in fact, they're archetypes that are really smaller pieces than these other archetypes. The protagonist is made up of two parts, an internal and an external aspect. Externally, they are the one that tries to pursue. They try to pursue the goal. And internally, they are the ones that are causing the story mind's internal mechanism to consider the problem. So in our own minds, when we feel motivated to pursue, and when we also are trying to make ourselves consider something even though we'd rather not, okay, that's the protagonist. The antagonist, on the other hand, the antagonist is someone who is trying to prevent or avoid on the outside, and on the inside, they're saying, don't consider or reconsider. You better not do this. You better not consider because, you know, you don't want to even think about this. Don't go there. That's what the antagonist says. Reason character, that has logic on the inside and is a controlled character on the outside, which we saw when we looked at Leia. She's very controlled. She has those tied down here thingies, and as a result of it, she's incredibly straight-laced, but also uses logic all the time at the expense of her emotions. In contrast is Chewbacca, who's very emotional on the inside, and outside Chewbacca is very uncontrolled, the opposite. That's why these are archetypes, is that they put together internal and external traits that work in tandem. They're sort of like just equivalents. The internal equivalent of pursue is consider. The internal equivalent of controlled is logic. The external equivalent of emotion, of feeling, which is one half of this, is uncontrolled on the outside. Now, the sidekick and the skeptic also have these, the faithful supporter, the disbelieving opposer, the helpful character who's also conscience, and the character who is the hinderer, who is your sense of temptation. Now, when we look at these archetypes, the traditional ones of the tempter and the trickster, well, the trickster is like the half of the contagonist that is the hinderer. And the half of the contagonist that is temptation is the tempter. So while you'll see them have these other archetypes by other names, or perhaps even by the same names listed, here they jump down to a different level of appreciation. They're looking more at the individual elements. So those archetypes really don't work together. If you have a trickster who's only a trickster, and you put them in with these other archetypes, it's not a balanced archetypal story.